Then that's when we came up and you just said, hey, Asian American. And it just, bam, that's it.
In May of 1968, 6 American activists of Asian heritage gathered to start an Oriental caucus. They ended up creating a new Asian American racial and political identity. Inspired by 1960s counterculturalism, the Asian American Political Alliance marked the beginning of the Asian American movement. For the first time, activists embraced a pan-Asian identity and committed to racial solidarity, community support, and anti-imperialism. Their work laid today's foundation for the Asian American identity. By the 1870s, in just 3 decades, tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants had arrived in California seeking gold. They instead became cheap laborer coolies. Nativism and economic hardship birthed the anti-Chinese movement. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first of several laws targeting Asian immigration. Others, like the Japanese and Filipinos, took advantage of Chinese exclusion and also began immigrating, yet faced similar discrimination. The movement forced rural Chinese to relocate and segregated urban areas. As the main Asian immigration port, San Francisco developed America's oldest China, Japan, and Manila towns. Residents supported each other within their ethnic groups, offering legal services, food programs, and political representation. Yet there wasn't racial unity among ethnicities. Typically, race in America has been viewed as a one-dimensional hierarchy. Whites at the top, blacks at the bottom, and everyone else somewhere between. But both black and white people are seen as true Americans. Yet Orientals who lived in America were seen as perpetual foreigners, always associated with their homelands. During this time, Yellow Peril ideology colored how white people saw the East. Asia held hordes of cowardly yellow heathens. Some Orientals attempted to distance themselves from black and indigenous people to climb the racial hierarchy. Others, like activist Wang Chunfu, embraced the heathen label. Love your neighbor as yourself is the great divine law which Christian and heathen alike hold, but which the Christians ignore. This is what keeps me the heathen I am, he decried. During World War II, Chinese exclusion was repealed when Japan became the new terror. Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps and their properties were seized. Chinese Americans posed as the good Asians. In 1966, Professor William Peterson wrote an article for the New York Times titled "Success Story, Japanese American Style." He praised the Japanese for being the only non-white minority to have overcome racism to achieve economic and social prosperity through family values, work ethic, and genetics. After, more articles praised various Asians as the meek model minority and used that to dismiss increasingly militant black activists. Some Asians embraced their status, like second-generation Japanese immigrant Howard Imazaki, who called on black people to better themselves before demanding equality. Yet, like 1800s Chinese, division among minorities only resulted in whites being elevated. Ironically, despite scolding African Americans in their quest for civil rights, the very same civil rights crusade was what uplifted the post-World War II view of Orientals. The civil rights quest for racial equality pushed President Lyndon B. Johnson to eliminate the racially motivated quota system for immigration. It was instead replaced with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which favored educated immigrants. Asians jumped from being 4 to 26% of immigrants. Asians were suddenly more visible and often had a higher social background. This period as a whole was quite politically tumultuous. Non-white youth especially rallied around anti-war and the civil rights movements as they felt the violence enacted by the U.S. military in Vietnam paralleled their minority status experiences in America. Anti-imperialist Oriental students began embracing their ethnic roots. In doing so, they aligned with exploited nations, frequently referred to as third world countries. The Black Power movement, the Peace and Freedom Party, and the United Farm Workers of America all had strong roots in California, where most of the Asian diaspora was. Despite being heavily involved within these groups, experienced Asians were denied leadership.
And being a woman, being a minority, not being black or not being white, that's kind of like where we were all at. You know, people who looked like me in the movement.
In May 1968, activists Yuji Ichioka and Emma G. dialed all the Asian-sounding people involved with the Berkeley Peace and Freedom movement to propose an Oriental Peace and Freedom Caucus. They gathered at 2005 Hearst Avenue.
Yuji broached the idea of what he'd been thinking of, and then as soon as he said, and I think instead of Oriental, what we should be called is Asian American. I can't tell you, no one had ever, I'd never heard of this before. I heard Asian, I heard American, but I never heard it, we're Asian American.
Was born. The Asian American Political Alliance, or APA, was an internationalist, radical grassroots organization. APA had workers, professionals, and students. They were proud of their differences, of being the Yellow Peril. Despite the majority student base, APA was intentionally a political alliance organizing for power, not a student organization. APA wasn't just anti-war, it was pro-communist Vietnam. APA believed that US wars in Asia were enabled by racism that dehumanized all Asians. This dehumanization allowed for the atrocities committed in the Philippine-American War and the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
My drill instructor says, "Private Nakayama, stand up." I stood up at attention. He goes, "Turn around." So I turned around and he goes, "All right, everybody, this is what a gook looks like. You remember this, because they're going to come after you."
APA aligned with indigenous, Latino, and Afro-American groups to create the Third World Liberation Front. The front led strikes at San Francisco State College and UC Berkeley in response to lack of racial diversity on campus and Eurocentric curriculums. Their demands had three themes. 1. The right of Third World students to relevant education. 2. The creation of a Third World college. And 3. The hiring of Third World faculty. After 5 months, the schools agreed to create the nation's first ethnic studies programs.
Number 1. That funds be allocated for the implementation of the Third World College. A. Department of Asian Studies, controlled by Asian people. B. Department of Black Studies, as proposed by the AASU. C. Department of Chicano Studies. D. Any other ethnic studies programs as they are developed and presented.
APA endorsed revolutions abroad and worked for change at home. Their avid support of Mao's communist revolution gained the attention of FBI Director Hoover. The FBI was specifically interested in any contact the group had had with Chinese communists abroad and began monitoring them in 1969. APA also focused on community issues, particularly affordable housing. The best-known fight began in 1968 at San Francisco's Manilatown International Hotel, when elderly Chinese and Filipino residents were served an eviction notice. The owner intended to tear down the building for development. The anti-eviction campaign lasted 9 years, with tenant organizing, protests, and community-led renovations. The basement became home to the first Asian American legal organization, interdisciplinary arts workshop, and bookstore. On eviction day, police broke a 3,000-person barricade and lifted residents out one by one. The building was demolished. Still, APA and the movement were remarkably effective. By creating language that encompassed all Asian ethnic groups under one umbrella, Asian Americans gained a lot more negotiating power. While APA was far from the only Asian American activist group, its inception established a frontier for how we discuss race in America today. By the end of the 1970s, the broader movement began dying, and APA dissolved. While APA's many student members were transitory, their spirit continued. They took pride in learning from and teaching their communities. In the following decades, Japanese Americans demanded internment reparations, and a new international hotel was built. Students flocked to Asian American studies, and Asian Americans joined forces with Hawaiians to combat plantation-based oppression. APA's interracial, ethnic, and international solidarity established a frontier in Asian American history. The association of Asian American as a political term galvanized people across the country. Today, Asian American Pacific Islander violence has resurged with the COVID-19 pandemic and has been compounded by historical misperceptions of Asians. Traces of the Yellow Peril and model minority myth continue casting Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners. As the Stop Asian Hate movement has already demonstrated, Asian Americans will continue APA's legacy of coalition building across ethnic and racial lines.